There is a kind of silence that isn't empty, a silence that is lived through something, that carries weight, that breathes differently than ordinary quiet. You've felt it, I think, in a room after an argument ends, in the space between a question asked and an answer that never comes, in the moment right before something changes forever, and you somehow already know. That kind of silence doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't need you to speak or explain or justify. It simply holds you, the way deep water holds a stone that's been thrown from a great height, without judgment, without fuss, just receiving. Most people spend their lives running from that silence, filling it, drowning it in noise and light and the endless, ordinary hum of distraction. Because silence, real silence, forces you to feel things you've been carefully avoiding. And that can be uncomfortable. It can be frightening, even. But sometimes, the most restful thing you can do is stop running and let it find you. Tonight, we're going to sit inside a very particular kind of silence. The silence of a girl who chose to become no one so that she could finally become herself. The silence of Arya Stark. Stay with me. There is a place in the north of Westeros, if you let your mind drift there, that smells like pine resin and cooled stone and bread baking somewhere deep inside a castle's billy. The wind off the mountains has a particular character. It doesn't howl exactly. It mutters, low and constant, like someone in the next room speaking words you almost understand. Winterfell is not a warm place. It was never meant to be warm, not really. It was meant to endure. Its walls are thick enough to absorb centuries of grief. Its towers stand without elegance or decoration, purely functional, purely northern. There is no softness in Winterfell, but there is something better than softness. There is permanence, the feeling that this place will still be standing long after the people inside it are gone. And in that grey, enduring place, a girl grew up who was never quite supposed to be who she was. She was the third child, the spare of the spare. She had a direwolf named Nymeria, named after a warrior queen, which perhaps tells you something about who she was, even then, even at the very beginning. She was given needlework and lessons in propriety, and she took both of them and set them aside, quietly, without drama, without rebellion exactly, simply an absence, a refusal that was never announced, just lived. Her name was Arya, and she is one of the most quietly extraordinary characters in the history of storytelling. Not because she was powerful, not because she was kind, or cruel, or destined for greatness, but because of what she did with silence. Because of what she made of the nothing she was handed. Let me take you through it slowly. There's no rush, the night is long. Before everything went wrong, and in this story, nearly everything goes wrong, Arya was simply a girl in a cold castle, living a life that didn't quite fit. Her sister Sansa had the golden life. The songs and the courtly dreams, and the beauty that made adults nod approvingly. Sansa was what was expected. Sansa gave people the comfort of familiarity, of things going as planned. Arya gave people the slight unease of things being slightly off. She sat wrong. She moved too quickly through rooms. She asked questions that were inconvenient. She didn't wear the right expression at the right moments. Not because she was trying to cause trouble, but because she simply couldn't locate the performance in herself. The mask that everyone else seemed to wear so naturally, she couldn't get it to stay on her face. This is not uncommon. You probably know someone like this. Maybe you were someone like this. The child who was always slightly misaligned with the room's expectations, who loved the wrong things with too much intensity, who felt the gap between what they were supposed to be and what they actually were, like a splinter, not large enough to be dramatic about, just constant and quietly maddening. There is a particular loneliness to being that kind of child. Not the loneliness of being unloved. Arya was loved in her family's complicated, fractured way. But the loneliness of feeling that the language everyone around you is speaking is not quite your native language. That you are always in every room, ever so slightly translating. Reaching for the right social word, the right expression, the right note of enthusiasm or deference, and finding it just a half beat late, just a shade off key. It is exhausting, that kind of translation work. Most children who experience it don't have words for what's happening to them. They just feel the drag of it, the sense that being around people costs something that being alone doesn't. That in the privacy of their own company, something relaxes that can never quite relax in the presence of others who are watching for the right performance. Arya trained with a sword in secret. She convinced a Braavosi water dancer named Syrio Forel to teach her the quick, elegant art of fighting light on your feet. And there is something in those early lessons that is worth sitting with for a moment. Syrio would ask her, "What do we say to the god of death?" And the answer was always, "Not today, not never, not I am unafraid, not death cannot touch me." Simply, not today. There is a kind of wisdom in that takes a long time to fully appreciate. It doesn't deny the thing it faces. It doesn't pretend. It just postpones. With complete calm, with steady eyes. Not today. Syrio was the first person who saw Arya clearly, not the daughter who wasn't quite right, not the girl who should have been paying more attention to the needlework. He saw someone who was built for a different kind of attention. The kind that operates in the present moment, in the body, through instinct and quick judgment, rather than the slow accumulation of social knowledge. He saw a fighter, not a warrior in the romantic sense, something quieter than that. A person who, when the moment required it, would simply be there, fully, without hesitation. He gave her a sword. He gave her a philosophy. He gave her, perhaps, most importantly, the experience of being known. That is not a small gift. To be seen clearly, without apology or correction. To have someone say, in effect, "Yes, this is what you are, and it is enough, and it is good." Arya would carry Syrio with her for years after he was gone, the particular way he stood, the lightness of his footwork, the lesson that the first gift is not strength but presence, that before you can do anything, you have to be entirely, unreservedly here. She would practice that presence in the most difficult of circumstances, in the dark, in the cold, surrounded by people who wished her harm. And she would find it again and again, that quality of being entirely here, because Syrio had shown her it was possible. Not today. She learned that, absorbed it deep into her bones, and she would need it, all of it, sooner than she knew. King's Landing is everything Winterfell is not. It is loud, hot, colourful, in a way that feels slightly wrong, like a bruise that hasn't finished forming. The city smells of humanity in all its least appealing forms. The harbour, the tanneries, the unwashed multitude pressed together under a southern sun that has no interest in mercy. Arya arrived there with her family, and almost immediately began losing them. First came the small losses, the way her life narrowed, the way the city expected things of her that she couldn't give. Then came the larger ones, the catastrophic ones, the kind that don't announce themselves until they're already done. I won't linger on the specific brutality of it. You likely know it. And if you don't, the details matter less than the shape of it, the way it happened in public, in light, in front of people who cheered, the way there was nowhere to hide from it. The way Arya was right there, close enough to almost reach him, close enough for the moment to be burned into her permanently, and completely powerless to stop any of it. She was a child. She was utterly alone. And the world had just shown her, in the most unambiguous terms possible, exactly how little kindness it intended to offer. What does a person do with that? Some people shatter. And there is no shame in shattering. Sometimes the shatter is the only honest response available. Some people go numb. Some people attach themselves to rage, which is at least a form of warmth, even if it burns you while it's burning everything else. Not passive, not resigned. Quiet in the way that very deep water is quiet. There is movement in it, but you can't see it from the surface. She began keeping a list, not written down, just held inside her. Murmured in the dark, in the moments before sleep, like a prayer in reverse, the names of the people who had taken things from her. Murmured not with heat, but with a strange, cold deliberateness. Joffrey, Cersei, Walder Frey, the Hound, Mirren Trant. The list changed over time, names added and sometimes removed, but the act of keeping it stayed constant. It was her anchor, her North Star. In a world that had stripped everything from her, this was the one thing she could hold. We'll come back to what that means. But for now, let's follow her out of King's Landing and into the dark. There is a character named Yoren, a man of the Night's Watch, who grabbed Arya in the crowd just after her father's execution and pulled her away. He covered her eyes. He cut her hair. He taught her to be a boy named Arya and to tell no one who she was. And just like that, Arya Stark ceased to exist. Officially, publicly. She became a nameless thing moving north in a group of criminals and orphans, hidden inside a disguise that was also, in some strange way, a kind of freedom. I want you to think about what it means to lose your name. Not just as a dramatic event in a story, but as a real experience, as something that happens to people in ways less extreme, but just as disorienting. We attach so much to our names. Our names are our first story. When someone calls your name across a room, your body responds before your mind does. It knows its own sound. And when the name is gone, when you become something else, something unnamed or misnamed or deliberately unknown, there is a vertigo to it, a groundlessness. The floor you didn't realize you'd been standing on reveals itself by disappearing. Consider the experience of moving to a new country, a new city, a new school, of walking into a room where no one knows your name and therefore no one carries any preconception of who you are. There is terror in that, the terror of being unmapped, uncharted, without the social coordinates that usually orient you. But there is also, if you let yourself feel it, something else, a lightness, a possibility. No one here knows what you failed at last year. No one carries the version of you that was embarrassing or afraid or wrong. You are only what you are right now, in this moment. Which is to say, you could be anything. Arya, of course, was not moving to a new school. The stakes were considerably higher, but the fundamental structure of the experience was the same, and she navigated it with a kind of radical pragmatism. She became Arya. She believed in Arya enough to make other people believe. She moved through the world in Arya's skin without vanishing. She held herself, her actual self, at the core and put the disguise on over it like a coat. This distinction matters. The Arya that Arya played was not a lie exactly. Lies require self-consciousness, require the awareness of the gap between a performance and the truth. What Arya did was more like method acting. She inhabited the role while remaining, at the centre, entirely herself. The list kept her there. The list, murmured in the dark, said, "I am not Arya. I am Arya Stark of Winterfell, and these are the people who have taken things from me." The road north was violent and hard, and punctuated with grief. She met the Hound, a man who was on her list, a man she should have hated completely, and found him complicated. Found him, despite everything, a source of grim survival wisdom. Hound herself keeping his company, even as she kept his name on her list. She met other versions of strength. She sat with loss in its many forms. She kept moving. And then she came to a place that asked her to become nothing at all. The city of Braavos sits on the water like a dream half remembered. Built on islands and pillars, threaded with canals, perpetually damp and grey, and beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with sunshine. There is a temple there, at the edge of the lagoon, with 2 doors, one black, one white. The House of Black and White, the home of the Faceless Men. She knocked on that door for a very long time before it opened. The Faceless Men are assassins, but not like assassins in stories usually are. They don't serve kings or pay. They serve the many-faced god, the god of death. The belief at the centre of their practice is that death is a gift, that the many-faced god lives in every religion, under every name, in every culture that has ever faced the fact of its own ending, and that to give the gift of death to those who need it, or those who have been given as offerings, is sacred work. To be trained in this work, you must first become no one. Not figuratively, literally. You must surrender your history, your preferences, your grudges, your loves, your name. You must learn to wear other faces, literally, the faces of the dead, and inhabit them so completely that there is no Arya underneath, looking out through someone else's eyes. There is only the face, only the role. A Jaqen Har, one of the Faceless, told her this when she arrived. A girl is not no one. A girl is Arya Stark of Winterfell, and a girl must leave that at the door. She tried. She tried for a long time. She swept floors and washed bodies, and learned to lie with her whole body, not just her mouth. She was tested again and again, in ways that required her to abandon everything she cared about. She was blinded for a time, literally made blind, so that she would learn to see with other senses, to feel without looking, to navigate by touch and sound and the particular weight of the air in a room. The work of the house was strange and slow and deeply, deeply patient. The Faceless Men did not hurry their training. They had been practicing this art for centuries. They understood something that most teachers don't, that the real work is not the teaching of skills. Skills can be taught in weeks, months at most. The real work is the undoing of the self that was there before the skills. The clearing of the ground. You have to remove the old structure before you can build the new one. And that removal is the slow part. That is the part that cannot be rushed. Arya swept floors that were already clean. She spoke in a language not her own. She wore clothes that were not her style. She ate food she didn't prefer, slept on surfaces she didn't choose, moved through her days in patterns that had nothing to do with her preferences. All of this was the slow dismantling, the gradual loosening of the grip the self keeps on the world around it. There is something in this that deserves quiet contemplation, being made blind so you can truly see, being forced to give up your name so you can understand what you actually are beneath it. These are not just fantastic story elements, they're descriptions of something that happens to people, in gentler ways, when life takes things from them. We discover what we are made of, not when things are full, but when they are empty. Even in Braavos, even in the House of Black and White, at night, in the dark, Arya murmured her list. This was her great act of resistance, not a dramatic one. Nobody knew she was doing it. There were no speeches, no confrontations. Just a girl, in the dark, whispering names she wasn't supposed to remember, holding on to something she wasn't supposed to keep. The list was, in some ways, a survival mechanism, a thread that connected her to herself, to her family, to the identity she was supposed to be dissolving. As long as she kept the list, she was still Arya, still the daughter of Ned Stark, still the girl from Winterfell with the direwolf and the water dancing lessons and the grief she hadn't finished having. But the list was also a kind of trap, because the names on the list had become her purpose. And purpose built on revenge is always precarious. It gives you direction, it keeps you moving, but it is also consuming you as it does so. You are burning your own material to stay warm. Arya was in the house of a god whose central teaching was that all men must die, and she had a list of specific men she wanted to die. These two things, the religious philosophy of impersonal death as gift and her deeply personal vendetta, were fundamentally incompatible. The faceless men knew this. They were waiting to see which one would win. She was too, in her way. There is something almost ritualistic about the way she said the names. In ritual, the exact repetition matters. You don't vary the words. You don't skip any of the steps. The repetition is the point. It reinforces the neural groove, keeps the intention alive, tells the body that this matters, that this is real, that we are not going to forget. Religious practitioners across cultures have understood this. The rosary, the mantra, the daily prayer spoken at the same hour, the rhythm of repetition is itself a kind of anchor. Arya's list saying was her religion, in a way. Her private devotional practice, carried out beneath the surface of whatever larger system she was nominally embedded in. In the sept, she would be paying the proper attention to the seven. In the House of Black and White, she would be going through the proper motions of training in the service of the many-faced god. And at night, alone, she would be practicing her own private faith. The faith of continuity. The faith that said, you are still here, you are still you. The names have not been forgotten, and the names protected her in ways she perhaps didn't fully understand. They kept the grief from becoming something abstract. The grief was specific. It had faces and names and particular moments attached to it. It was not this large, undifferentiated weight of loss. It was the loss of specific people in specific circumstances by specific hands. And keeping those specificities alive kept the grief from spreading to fill every corner of her. It was contained, pointed, purposeful. The faceless men asked her to dissolve into something larger than herself. The list kept her located. It was the pen that fixed the butterfly to the board. The blindness period is one of the most important passages in Arya's story, and it is also one of the quietest. She wanders Braavos blind, begging. A girl named the wife comes to beat her regularly, not cruelly, exactly, but without mercy. Testing her, training her through pain in the dark. And slowly, Arya begins to understand. She cannot see, so she must listen. She must feel the air. She must map her world through sound. The particular drip of water that tells her she's near the canal. The smell of frying fish that means the market is 30 steps to the left. The subtle change in ambient noise that tells her someone is approaching before they are close enough to be a threat. She learns the city by feel. She learns her own body's responses as a kind of instrument. She learns that sight, which she always took for granted, was actually covering over a vast amount of other information she'd been ignoring. There is a way of seeing that relies entirely on the obvious, on the information that presents itself loudly, at the front, already formatted for easy consumption. The bright colours, the large shapes, the things that catch the eye and demand attention. This is how most of us move through the world most of the time, scanning for the loud things, ticking in the easy data. But beneath that layer of loud information, there is a much subtler frequency. The peripheral, the quiet, the half-felt, the texture of a silence, the weight of a person's posture across the room, the way a conversation changes pace when someone is about to say something they've been holding back. The particular quality of an attention that is hostile versus simply watchful. These things don't announce themselves. They require a different kind of listening, slower, softer, more patient. Arya, blinded, was forced to learn all of this, and when she got her sight back, she was different, more precise, more still, more dangerous, in the way that truly quiet things are dangerous, not because they announce themselves, but because they don't. There is a great deal of practical wisdom in this that applies to ordinary life. Not the literal blindness, but the willingness to dim one channel in order to strengthen another. To close your eyes during a conversation and simply listen to the voice, to its rhythm, its hesitations, the places it softens and the places it hardens. To turn away from the screen and simply sit with the weight of a room. To eat a meal without distraction and actually taste it. We are so overstimulated, most of us, most of the time, that these quieter channels have been turned down so low they're almost inaudible. We've forgotten they exist, and so we miss enormous amounts. We miss the subtleties. We miss the thing beneath the thing being said. We miss the moment when something small and important is happening that will only be recognizable later, when it's too late to respond to it in real time. Arya's blindness was punitive in intention, but what it gave her was something closer to a gift. It stripped away the dominant channel and made her fluent in all the others. And that fluency, that expanded repertoire of attention, made her in the end someone who could not easily be surprised. There is something worth examining in the character of the wife. She is Arya's primary antagonist during the Braavos years. She comes to beat her in the streets. She is relentless, precise, and apparently without feeling. She fails Arya constantly, reports her failures to the faceless men, undermines her, seems to take something like pleasure in her suffering. On the surface, the wife is simply an obstacle, a tormentor, the bully in the school of assassins. But look a little longer. The wife is someone who succeeded at the thing Arya cannot quite manage. She became no one, fully and apparently completely. She erased herself. And she did it, it seems, out of something like resentment. She gave herself up because the self she had was not one she wished to keep. The House of Black and White offered her the chance to put down a story she found unbearable, and she took it with both hands. She dissolved into the service of the many-faced god, the way a person drowning will take any hand that's offered, not because the hand is necessarily trustworthy, but because the alternative is to keep drowning. The wife hates Arya, not just because Arya resists, but because Arya's resistance is an affront. It says, I have something worth keeping. I have a self I won't give up. And that implicit declaration is precisely what the wife cannot tolerate, because it reminds her of what she gave away. This dynamic between the person who dissolved to survive and the person who refuses to dissolve is not unique to this story. You find it in families, in workplaces, in institutions of all kinds. The person who made the sacrifice resents the person who found another way. The person who accepted the terms resents the person who renegotiated them. The person who went along to get along is infuriated by the person who simply didn't and got away with it. The tests the waif administers to Arya are not really about whether Arya is strong enough or skilled enough. They are about whether Arya will become the same kind of erased that the waif became, and the answer always is no. This is what makes Arya's final victory over the waif significant, beyond the physical. She doesn't just defeat the waif, she defeats the model of survival through erasure that the waif represents. She demonstrates, in the only language available to her in that world, which is the language of physical combat, that there is another way. That you can develop all the skills, learn all the techniques, pass through all the fires, and come out the other side still knowing who you are. Ultimately, Arya couldn't do it, couldn't fully become no one, couldn't finish dissolving, and this is the part of the story I find most human. She was sent to kill a woman, a character called Lady Crane, an actress, and she got close enough to do it, close enough to study her, and found that she couldn't. Lady Crane had done nothing wrong, really. She was on her list not because of her own crimes, but because of political intrigues. Arya had no part in, and something in Arya, that same something that kept murmuring the list in the dark, said, no. Not this. The faceless men were not pleased. She retrieved her sword, a thin, Bravosy blade she hidden before entering the temple, hidden because she knew some part of herself wasn't ready to be fully no one, and she fought. Blind and fast and utterly committed, she fought the wife through the streets of Bravos in the dark, in a candle-lit room where they were equally sightless, equally stripped of the advantage of sight. And she won. Then she told Jaqen H'ghar something that is, I think, the true emotional centre of her entire arc. She said, a girl is Arya Stark of Winterfell, and I am going home. That sentence, that short, quiet, completely confident sentence, not shouted, not triumphant in the way stories usually celebrate triumph, just stated, clear-eyed, final. A person who has gone through the furnace of having their identity stripped away, tested, erased, dismantled, and come out the other side knowing, with perfect certainty, exactly who they are. That is not a small thing. That is a very large thing, actually. The sentence contains everything. It contains Bravos, and the wife, and the list, and the blindness, and the floor sweeping, and the bodies washed in the dark, and the years are being shaped towards something she ultimately refused to become. It contains Winterfell, the smell of pine resin and cold stone, and her father's voice, and the direwolf we left, and the sister who survived, and the brother who returned from the dead. It contains every loss, and every lesson, and every night in the dark with the names on her lips. All of it compressed into that one sentence, delivered without drama. Because the drama was over. The drama was always internal. The external events were just the arena in which the internal drama played out, and the internal drama had been resolved. She knew who she was. There is a concept in psychology, and I'm going to use this word gently, not in a clinical way, called identity consolidation. It's the process by which a person moves from having a fragile, externally defined sense of self towards something more internal, more stable, more resilient to circumstance. Most people achieve some version of this in ordinary ways, through the quiet accumulation of experience and self-reflection and the gentle tests that life provides. But some people achieve it through extremity, through situations so demanding, so stripped back, so relentlessly honest in what they ask of you, that the only way through is to find out who you actually are. Arya's story is a story about extremity, about what it costs to know yourself. Consider what was taken from her in sequence. Her social identity. She went from being the daughter of the Lord of Winterfell to being a nameless orphan in a crowd of criminals. Her family, one by one, through death and separation and the particular violence of that world. Her physical autonomy. She was captured, confined, dependent on the mercy of people who had no particular reason to extend it. Her name, in Braavos, explicitly, formally demanded. Her sight, a test that felt punitive but was actually instructive. Her purpose, or rather, she was asked to give up her personal purpose and replace it with an impersonal one. Each of these losses stripped away a layer of the constructed identity. The identity that had been built by external factors, her family's status, her gender's expected performance, her culture's definitions of what a girl should be and want and do. And underneath each stripped layer, she found something that didn't dissolve. The list. Now, the list is troubling if you think about it carefully. A list of people to kill is not usually what we hold up as an example of psychological health. And it isn't. It is genuinely a coping mechanism for grief and powerlessness. It is the way a traumatized child organizes an experience too large to hold in any other form. But here is what I want to offer you at this late hour, as the quiet settles in around you. The list kept her. It kept her connected to herself when everything else was pulling her apart. It was not healthy, and it was not unhealthy. It was simply what she had, what she could make of what she was given. We often make lists like areas, in our own small ways. Not lists of people to kill, but lists of grievances. Lists of the ways we've been wronged. Lists of the people who owe us something, apologies, or acknowledgement, or restitution, or simply the painful clarity of admission. We carry these lists in us for years sometimes, murmuring them in our own dark. And they keep us, and they cost us. Both the question Arya's story asks, quietly, in the margins, without ever stating it directly, is whether there comes a moment when the list has done its work. When you've carried it far enough, used it hard enough, held on to it through the night enough times, and you can finally set it down. Not forget, not forgive necessarily, just release. Arya never fully answers that question, which is perhaps the most honest choice the storytellers could have made, because in life, those questions rarely get clean answers either. The Faceless Men represent something specific in the way they train. They understand that selfhood, the story you tell about who you are, can be a limitation. That if you are too attached to being Arya Stark, you can only do what Arya Stark can do. But if you can become no one, you can do anything, wear any face, move through any space. You become fluid where others are fixed. There is a school of Buddhist thought that says something similar. The self is not a thing that exists exactly. It is a process, a story being told moment by moment. And attachment to the story, to the particular narrative of who you are, is a source of suffering. Let the story go, and you lose the suffering. The Faceless Men take this to an extreme that makes it sinister. But the underlying insight is not sinister. It is, in fact, deeply liberating in the right context. We all carry versions of ourselves that are heavier than they need to be. Identities built on old wounds, old definitions, old roles that we were handed by people who didn't know us very well. The child who was told they were difficult, who internalized that difficulty as a permanent feature rather than a context-specific response. The teenager who was told they were too sensitive, who spent decades trying to harden themselves against something that was actually a gift. The adult who defined themselves for years by a relationship that ended, or a career that failed, or a version of success that turned out to belong to someone else's life. We hold onto these identities the way Arya held onto her name. Not because they serve us, necessarily, but because the alternative, becoming no one for a moment, letting the story breathe, releasing the grip, feels like annihilation. It isn't though. Arya came back from no one, more fully herself than she'd ever been. That's the paradox the story offers. You have to be willing to let go of who you think you are to find out who you actually are. The distinction is subtle but crucial. The self that Arya returned to at the end of her Bravos training was not the same self she had brought to the door of the House of Black and White. That girl was Arya in the raw, all the grief and the anger and the list and the cold determination. What she came back with was something more refined, the same material, yes, the same essential nature, but clarified. Purified through fire, through loss, through the radical experience of having tried to become nothing and found that some part of her simply wouldn't go. The things that don't dissolve are the real things. Everything else, the status, the name, the social role, the performance of the expected self, these can be stripped away. And sometimes that stripping is violent and unwanted, and it is grief to lose them. But beneath all of it, there is something that is simply you, irreducibly, inarguably you, that no circumstance can take. You discover it only in the extremity, only when the other options have been removed. Only when you've tried, genuinely tried, to be someone else, and found that you can't quite finish the job. One of the things Arya's story does that I find quietly profound is its attention to the body, to physical discipline as a form of self-knowledge. She trains constantly. From the very beginning, Syrio Forel in King's Landing, the long nights in Bravos, sparring in the dark with the wife, the repetitive physical work of the temple. for the kind of awareness that only comes when you've done something so many times that it no longer requires thought, when your body simply knows. There is a way of being in your body that most of us have lost, somewhere in the process of growing up in a world that privileges the mind. We think ourselves through things. We strategize and analyze and plan. And the body becomes a vehicle, something we transport from place to place, while the real work happens elsewhere, in our heads. Arya never loses her body. The sword practice, the sprinting, the years of hardship that made her lean and quick and precise. Her body is always with her, always engaged. And when she needs it, when everything else has failed, when there is no plan and no strategy, and just the dark room and the waif, her body knows what to do, because she trusted it enough to teach it. There is something in this for all of us. Something about the value of physical discipline, not as punishment or vanity, but as a kind of love, a sustained attention paid to the instrument you live in, so that it can carry you through the moments when thinking isn't enough. The body keeps score, as they say in a different context. It holds what the mind can't process. It carries the old losses in its posture, in its tensions, in the particular patterns of bracing and softening that develop over years of navigating a world that is sometimes kind and sometimes not. And it also holds the victories, the things practiced until they became instinctual, the physical knowledge that no amount of bad luck or grief can take, because it lives in the cells, in the muscle memory, in the deep automatic knowing that doesn't need thought to activate. Arya's body is her archive. Everything she has survived is written in how she moves. There is something the faceless men do that is stranger and more profound than the killing. They wear faces, literally, the preserved faces of the dead, taken and placed over their own. And they inhabit those faces so completely that they become indistinguishable from the person those faces belong to. They remember that person's particular way of moving, their mannerisms, the cadence of their speech, the small involuntary gestures that no one consciously controls. This is, when you sit with it, an extraordinary meditation on identity, on what a person is and what remains of them when the body is gone. We like to think that our identity lives in our mind, in our memories, our opinions, our internal narrative. But a faceless man demonstrates that identity is also, perhaps equally, in the surface, in the particular way a face moves when it is surprised, the micro-expressions, the way the eyes track, the set of the mouth when at rest, the specific angle at which a head tilts when listening carefully. These are not merely performances of a self, they are the self, made visible. They are the accumulated physical record of a life lived in a specific body, in a specific way. When Arya wears a face, she is not simply wearing a disguise. She is temporarily inhabiting a life, accessing the particular world orientation of a person who moved through existence differently than she does, taller or shorter, more fearful or more certain, carrying different accumulated tensions in the shoulders, the jaw, the hands. This is something actors know. The body character comes before the psychological character, often. You find the walk, and the character emerges from the walk. You find the particular tension that this person lives in, and the psychology reveals itself through the physiology. The outside shapes the inside. Arya learns this more completely than any actor ever has, because she is not performing for an audience. She is performing for herself and for the world, for survival, for purpose, for the work. There is no fourth wall. There is no break at the end of the scene. She has to sustain the inhabitation completely, without the luxury of stepping outside it. And what she discovers in the process is that other lives feel different from the inside than they look from the outside. That the face she wears comes with something, a residue, a residence, a faint imprint of the consciousness that shaped it over years of living. She cannot access their memories, but she can access, somehow, the shape of them. The way the world fitted around them, or didn't. The places of ease and the places of constriction. She wears many faces and comes back to her own, each time with a slightly different understanding of what her own face is. What it means to have this particular shape to the world, this particular set of permissions and constraints, this particular history pressing forward into the present through the set of the jaw and the instinctive readiness of the hands. Your own face is not neutral. It is not simply the surface you are born with. It is the record of everything you've felt and held and decided and suppressed and expressed over all the years of your life. Every person who looks at it closely can read something of what's there if they know how to look. And you, looking in the mirror, can sometimes see it too. The place where something old and painful is still held. The line that wasn't there 5 years ago. The expression that appears unbidden in unguarded moments. Arya knows her face. She knows it the way you only know something by having temporarily lost it, by having worn other faces and felt the difference. Her face, returned to, is not just her face. It is her argument for her own existence, her non-negotiable insistence on being who she is. I want to spend a little time with the Hound, because I think he is one of the more quietly important relationships in Arya's story, and also one of the most misread. He is on her list. He is a brutal, damaged, frequently cruel man who has done terrible things and who makes no apologies for any of them. He is not redeemed in the conventional narrative sense. He doesn't become good. He doesn't find love. He doesn't have a transformative moment of grace. And yet, he and Arya travel together for months, through terrible country, in terrible circumstances. They develop a relationship that is, in its strange, prickly way, one of the most honest in the entire story. Because the Hound doesn't pretend. He doesn't tell her comforting things. He doesn't soften the reality of what the world is. He says hard, true things in his abrasive way, and she takes them in, and she uses them. He teaches her something that is harder to learn than sword technique, or lockpicking, or the art of becoming no one. He teaches her that people are complicated, that the person who did a terrible thing is not simply and only that terrible thing, that inside every monster is a human history of their own losses, their own fears, their own version of the list murmured in the dark, though they'd never frame it that way. This does not excuse the terrible things. The Hound would be the first to say so. He has no interest in being excused. But it does complicate them. It makes them legible in a different way. Not forgivable, necessarily, but understandable, which is a different thing. For Arya, who is operating on a world of absolute moral clarity, the people on the list did wrong things, and therefore they are simply wrong. This complication is difficult. It challenges the architecture of the list. If the Hound can be both on her list and someone she sits beside in something that functions like companionship, then the list is not as clean as it needed to be. The people on it are are not simply symbols. They are human beings, damaged and damaging, and she is also a human being, damaged and damaging, and the line between them is not as absolute as she needs it to be. She doesn't resolve this tension. The Hound stays on the list even as she comes to understand him, which is actually the more honest response. Some things can both be true. The person can be understandable and still have done the unacceptable. The relationship can be real, and the injury can still need acknowledging. What the Hound gives her, in the end, is a model of hard honesty, of being exactly what you are without apology or performance or the pretense of goodness. He is what he is. Arya, watching him, learns to be similarly unequivocal about herself. Not cruel, she is not cruel, but honest, clear, unwilling to perform a version of herself that doesn't exist. This is, in its way, one of the most unusual gifts a character can give another. He shows her that radical authenticity is possible, even in a form she would not choose and cannot admire. And she takes the lesson without necessarily taking the form. There is a structural truth embedded in Arya's story that I want to name explicitly, because it is one of the things that makes it feel so true. Survival is not a single dramatic act. It is not a battle won, or a decision made, or a moment of breakthrough. Survival is the accumulation of small decisions made repeatedly in conditions of varying difficulty. The decision to get up again, the decision to keep the list, the decision to sweep the floor even when it is already clean, the decision to learn the city by sound, the decision to hide the sword before entering the temple, the decision to refuse to kill Lady Crane. None of these decisions, individually, is what saved Arya. The accumulation of them is. The sustained, quiet, mostly invisible practice of choosing to persist and to remain in whatever form remaining was available. This is uncomfortable news in some ways, because we tend to want the dramatic turn, the single moment when things change. The pivot point. It makes better stories, the pivot point. And there are pivot points in Arya's journey. The execution, the arrival in Braavos, the final confrontation with the wife. These are real structural moments, but they are supported by everything in between, which is the actual work. The undramatic daily practice of keeping yourself alive and yourself. And that undramatic daily practice is invisible in stories because it doesn't make good television. But it is the truth of survival. It is the thing that happens in the gaps between the pivots, and it is what makes the pivots possible. You know this from your own life. If you're the dramatic, dark order of pivot, and not dark Movis, but they were surrounded by all the quiet days of simply continuing, the mornings you got up when you didn't want to, the hours you functioned when functioning felt impossible, the small choices to eat, to sleep, to speak to someone, to do the ordinary thing that added up over time to a life that was still going. That is Arya's real achievement, not the sword fights. The quiet persistence of the days between the sword fights, the fact that she kept going when there was no dramatic reason to keep going, when the arc of the story wasn't at a climax, when it was just another cold morning in Braavos and the floor needed sweeping again, and the list was the only company she had. There is one more aspect of Arya's psychology worth sitting with before we move on. She is, from beginning to end, a person in grief. This is sometimes obscured by the action, the violence, the cold precision of her later self. But the whole structure of her story is a grief structure. Everything she does, including the list, including the training, including the refusal to dissolve, is in some deep way a response to loss. And her grief is interesting because it doesn't look like typical fictional grief. She doesn't weep dramatically. She doesn't collapse. She doesn't spend pages and scenes processing the emotions in ways that are recognizable and relatable in the conventional narrative sense. Her grief is largely interior, largely silent, largely expressed through action rather than expression. This is actually much more accurate to how grief works in real people than the dramatic version usually offered by stories. Most people who are grieving don't cry at all the right moments. They cry at strange, unexpected things, a particular smell, an overheard phrase, a specific way light falls through a window at a certain hour. They function normally, sometimes extremely normally, for long stretches. They go to work. They make dinner. They have perfectly ordinary conversations. And underneath all of that, entirely out of sight, the grief is doing its slow, inexorable work. Arya is like this. She functions. She functions incredibly well, actually. She's one of the most competent characters in the story, by any measure. But underneath the function, the grief never stops. The list is the grief. The training is the grief. The refusal to give up her name is the grief. All of it is the grief, wearing different clothes, expressing itself through the channels available to her. And there is something deeply honouring about that portrayal. It says, grief is not a performance. It is not a designated emotional period after which you are expected to be done. It is a fundamental restructuring of the self in response to loss. And it takes as long as it takes. It runs underneath everything. It is compatible with extraordinary competence and presence, and even humour. It is not weakness. It is simply what it is, the cost of having loved something that is now gone. Before we leave the story section entirely, I want to linger for a moment on the North, on Winterfell as more than a place. In the world of this story, North has a specific moral resonance. The North is harsh and cold, and without the polish of Southern culture. Northerners are blunt. They don't do ceremonies well. They say what they mean, more often than not, because the cold and the distance from courtly culture haven't trained them in the Southern arts of pleasant deception. Ned Stark, Arya's father, was the North embodied. He was a man of his word, in a world that had forgotten what words were for. He was honest in a court built on lies. His honesty is weaponized against him. His integrity is treated as naivety and exploited as weakness. There is a version of Arya's story that reads her transformation, the years away, the training in bravos, the acquisition of skills her father never had, as a movement away from northern values, as a pragmatic corruption, a necessary becoming of something harder and more worldly, in order to survive in a world that destroyed her father's simpler virtues. But I don't think that's quite right. I think what Arya actually does is take the essential northern quality, the directness, the honesty, the refusal to perform what isn't felt, and preserve it through the long years of wearing other faces. The faceless men tried to teach her southern fluency, the ability to be anything to anyone, the supreme political skill of the shapeshifter. And she learned those skills. She learned them well, but she didn't displace the northern core with them. She added them on top. The person who says, finally, a girl is Arya Stark of Winterfell. That person is speaking in the northern voice. Undecorated, unambiguous, without diplomatic softening. This is what I am, and I am going home. Northernness is an internal quality rather than a geographical one, as a commitment to a certain kind of honesty, as the decision to be, finally and completely, exactly what you are. Let me come away from Westeros for a moment. Let me bring this somewhere closer. We all know someone who has been through something that should have broken them, and somehow didn't. Maybe you are that person. Maybe you've looked at yourself in a mirror after something that stripped everything away and thought, how am I still here? How did I make it through that? And who am I now exactly on the other side? Arya's story is an extreme version of something that happens to ordinary people all the time. The loss of a parent, particularly when it's sudden, particularly when it's public in some way, when it happens in a context where you have to perform composure, where you can't fall apart because the moment doesn't allow it. There is a dissociation that can happen in those moments. A splitting of the self into the part that is experiencing the grief and the part that has to keep functioning, keep moving, keep putting one foot in front of the other through the courtyard and the crowds and the ordinary business of the world continuing to turn. People who've been through that describe something similar to what Arya goes through. The way survival sometimes requires you to step out of yourself slightly, to observe from a small distance while the body moves and responds and does what needs to be done. And then the very long, very quiet work of finding your way back to yourself afterwards. There is a particular kind of aloneness that comes after the loss of a parent that is difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. Not the social aloneness of missing their presence, though that is real and heavy, but the structural aloneness, the sense that a layer of protection has been removed, that there is no longer someone between you and the full reality of your own mortality, that you are now at the front of the line in a way you weren't before. Arya lost her father and was also made fully, brutally alone in the world in a single public moment. The two things happened simultaneously. She didn't have the luxury of quiet grief. She was handed the grief and the aloneness and the immediate necessity of survival all at once, and she had to manage all three simultaneously with no preparation and no support. The remarkable thing is not that she became the specific kind of damage that she did, the cold precision, the list, the difficulty with ordinary human warmth. The remarkable thing is that she managed it at all, that she kept going, that she didn't simply stop. Or consider the experience of starting over, of having an identity that was secure, a career, a community, a relationship, a sense of purpose, and then losing it. Not catastrophically necessarily, sometimes through choices, sometimes through circumstances, but losing it nonetheless. Finding yourself without the floor you built your life on, having to navigate unfamiliar terrain with skills that may or may not transfer, finding out who you are when none of the external markers are there to confirm it. This is what Arya does in Braavos. She starts over in the most radical way imaginable, without her name, her face, her history. And she discovers that something remains, something always remains. The people who have been through this kind of displacement, whether through job loss, relationship breakdown, illness, relocation, any of the many forms it takes in ordinary life, describe a process that has recognizable phases. First, the disorientation, the loss of the familiar coordinates that told you where you were. Then, often, a kind of casting about, trying on new identities, new roles, new stories about who you might become. Some of these fit partially, some don't fit at all, And then, slowly, over time, something settles. Something quieter and more fundamental than any of the identities that were tried on. Something that was there all along, underneath the social constructions, just waiting to be found. Arya finds this. She doesn't find it comfortably. She doesn't find it quickly. She finds it through years of extreme discipline and testing and loss, and the specific peculiar mortification of trying to be no one and discovering again and again that she can't quite manage it. But she finds it, and what she finds is not heroic in any external sense. It's not great power or special destiny or divine favour. It's simply herself. Clear, unmistakable, non-negotiable, the bedrock beneath everything else. There is a particular kind of sadness that comes from meeting a younger version of yourself in fiction. Not nostalgia exactly, something sharper. Recognition. Most people who respond strongly to Arya recognise her from somewhere real. The kid who was too much, who had too much feeling, too much energy, too much wanting. He was handed a particular script by the world and kept accidentally improvising, not out of rebellion, but out of some inability to pretend the script was real. There is enormous cultural pressure on children, but especially on girls, especially on certain kinds of girls, to perform softness, to perform the absence of ambition, or at least its domestication into acceptable forms, to sit still, to want the things that are on offer, to find joy in the structures provided. Some children are able to do this. Some are even genuinely built for it, genuinely happy in those structures, and there is nothing wrong with that. But some children simply cannot locate the performance in themselves, and those children have a difficult time for a while. Not a permanent time necessarily, but a while. The years of feeling misaligned, of being told in various ways that their particular flavour of personhood is inconvenient, excessive, too much, too sharp, too something. Those years leave marks. They get internalised. They contribute to the story a person tells about themselves. The story that says, something about me requires adjustment. What Arya offers them, what she offered an enormous number of people when they first encountered her story, was the possibility that the misalignment wasn't a defect, that the inability to fit neatly into the expected shape wasn't a failure, that the sharp edges and the stubbornness and the preference for difficult truths over comfortable fictions were going to become, eventually, a kind of strength. Not a comfortable strength, not an easy one, but real. The world changes. The qualities that made you inconvenient at 11 or 14 or 17, the intensity, the directness, the refusal to perform things you don't feel, these are often the qualities that make you remarkable at 35 or 40. Because the world, eventually, runs out of use for pleasant conformity and discovers that it actually needs people who can see clearly and speak honestly and refuse to pretend the emperor has clothes. Arya grows into her own peculiar qualities, the way a young tree grows into the space it was given, without apology, in exactly the direction its nature dictates. The world she inhabits is brutal and demands things of her that no one should be asked to give. But it never asks her to be someone she isn't, and neither, eventually, does she. There is one more real-life parallel I want to draw before we go deeper still. Arya is not, in the end, particularly dramatic. That might sound strange to say about a character who goes through so much violence and loss and extraordinary circumstance, but her emotional register, particularly as she grows older, is one of understatement. She does not announce her pain. She does not perform her grief. She is not defined by the tragedy that shaped her in the way that tragedy so often defines people in stories. She just moves, quietly, precisely, with a particular economy of feeling that can look, from the outside, like coldness, but isn't. You know people like this, people who've been through things that would break most of us, and somehow carry it without drama, who show up, do the work, are present and capable, and sometimes even gentle, while holding inside them a history that would flatten you if they ever let it out all at once. They don't let it out all at once. They've learned not to. They've learned to let it out slowly, in the margins, in the dark, in the small private moments when no one is watching. There is a particular grace in that, unsung and mostly invisible but real. The quiet ones carry things that the loud ones couldn't hold for a day. The underestimation of quiet people is one of the more reliable social mistakes humans make. We confuse loudness with strength, performance with depth, the declaration with the reality. And so the quiet ones move through the world somewhat underestimated, which occasionally works in their favour, and more often simply means that their contributions go unacknowledged, their suffering goes unseen, their resilience goes unnamed. This narration is, in part, a naming of that, a fact of the continent. This narration isn't all about. A man, for the most part, is all about. This men from both sides do see what they do in the dark. For everyone who has swept the floor and washed the bodies, and kept going through the years of training that seemed to lead nowhere, all while holding, at the centre, something that wouldn't dissolve. You are seen. Even when, especially when, you're not performing for an audience. What do you do with a silence that has lived through something? I come back to this question, the one I opened with, because I think it's where the real conversation lives. Not in the plot events, not in the specific mechanics of swords and conspiracies and revenge fulfilled, but here, in this much smaller, much older question. Silence that has survived something is not the same as ordinary silence. It has a texture to it, or weight. It's the silence of someone who has already said the difficult thing and is simply waiting for the world to process it. Or the silence of someone who's decided not to say the difficult thing because they've recognized it would change nothing. Or the silence of someone who is so far beyond ordinary speech that words have stopped feeling adequate. Arya's silence, by the end of her story, is all of these, layered over each other. She has said some of the difficult things, in actions, if not in words. She has made certain statements about who she is and what she will and will not do, and she has made them with her whole body, not just her mouth. And she has kept others folded inward, as people do when they've learned that the world doesn't always deserve the full truth of what you carry. But here is the thing about silence that I want to offer you gently, now, as the hour grows late and the world outside is moving away from you into the comfortable dark. Silence is not absence. That is the central misunderstanding of silence. We hear it as nothing and assume it means nothing. But silence is always full. It is made of everything that was not said, everything that was felt and held, every word that arrived at the mouth and turned back, every question that rose up in the night and found no answer. The silence of Arya Stark is full, extraordinarily full of Winterfell and Syrio and her father in the crowd, and the list murmured in the dark, and the canals of Braavos, and the smell of bodies in the temple, and the weight of a face that is not your own. That's a lot to carry quietly, but she carries it. We built a culture that is suspicious of silence. We mistake it for vacancy or depression or social failure. We rush to fill it, to interpret it, to resolve it. In conversation, a 3-second pause feels like an emergency. We leap in with sound before the silence can finish what it was doing. But silence does things. It does specific, irreplaceable things that sound cannot do. Silence allows a feeling to complete itself, to arrive fully and then pass, rather than being interrupted halfway through by the next thing. Silence allows another person to feel genuinely heard, not just listened to while you compose your response, but held in a space of unhurried attention. Silence allows a thought to develop past its first obvious form into something more true and more interesting. Children know this instinctively. Before they learn to perform comfort and relatability, before the social training kicks in, a small child who witnesses something overwhelming will often just go quiet. Not sad quiet necessarily, just still. Processing, letting the things settle through them at whatever pace it needs. We lose that, most of us. We learn to cover the silence because silence is suspicious. Silence is uncomfortable. Silence is what you do when you have nothing to offer. But maybe silence is what you do when you have too much. When the thing you're holding is larger than any words you found for it yet. When the feeling is still in the process of being understood, and any premature expression of it would be a simplification, a falsification. When the best thing you can do for a relationship, for another person, for yourself, is to stop speaking and simply be present in the difficulty of the moment, without reaching to make it easier. There is a kind of intimacy available only in silence. The kind that says, I am here with you in this, and I'm not trying to fix it or explain it or move us past it. I'm simply here. That kind of presence is rarer than speech and worth more. I want to return to that phrase, not today. It's Arya's, Sirio's, the water-dancing answer to the god of death, and I've been carrying it around in this narration, setting it down and picking it back up, because I think it's genuinely interesting, and I don't want to rush past it. Not today is a philosophy of the present moment in the face of an overwhelming future. Death is coming. Everyone in this story knows this. Everyone in any story knows this. You and I know this, but it is not here, right now. And what we do with the now, the actual breathing present moment, is not dictated by the eventual destination. There is a way of living that is essentially a continuous argument with the future, a rehearsal of catastrophes, an attempt to prepare for every possible version of what might happen by pre-suffering all of them right now, so that when they arrive, you'll be ready. This does not work. The future catastrophes, when they come, are always differently shaped than your preparations. And the effort of pre-suffering them, what is the problem? When the problem is me, the future catastrophes are always time. Not today is the alternative. It is not naive. It does not say, death is not coming. It does not promise anything. It simply places the attention here, in this body, in this moment, in what is actually being asked of you right now, and refuses to surrender the now to the not yet. This is extremely difficult. I don't want to make it sound easy. The mind that has been through loss, real loss, doesn't surrender its vigilance easily. Vigilance feels protective. The constant monitoring of what might go wrong feels like it's preventing the next catastrophe, but it isn't. It's just exhausting, and it keeps you in a perpetual state of bracing, of being tensed against an impact that hasn't arrived yet. The muscles don't relax. The breath stays high and shallow. The world appears through a filter of potential threat, and its actual texture, the real, complicated, sometimes beautiful texture of what is actually happening right now, gets lost behind the scanning. Not today is the breath, the release of the brace, the permission to let the present moment be what it is, rather than a prologue to the feared future. Arya, at her best, practices not today. She doesn't worry about the list when she's fighting. She doesn't grieve her father when she's running. She is fully in the moment requires. And then, in the quiet of the night, in the dark, she brings the list back, gives the grief its time, and then sleeps. That is not a small skill. That is one of the hardest skills there is. Something I find quietly remarkable about Arya's arc is what she refuses to become, what the story refuses to let her become. She could have become cynical, fully, completely, without remainder. After what she sees and loses and is subjected to, the execution, the wandering, the repeated betrayal by a world that doesn't care about justice the way she does, she had every right to simply harden into glass, to stop caring about anything except the list, to become a weapon without attachment. She doesn't. It's subtle and sometimes hard to see under the violence of her choices, but she doesn't. She cries, sometimes, when she thinks no one is watching. She feels genuine grief when people she cares about are taken. She makes connections, unlikely, uncomfortable ones, with people like the Hound, who should by rights be enemies, and lets them matter, even knowing they won't last. She keeps herself open in some fundamental way that the story could easily have closed. This is the thing about people who've been through real hardship and come out intact, not undamaged, intact. They haven't closed. They've become more selective about what they open for, more careful, more calibrated. But there is still an aperture there, still a willingness to let things in. The ones who've fully closed, they're easy to recognize. Everything bounces off the outside. They're safe, in a sense, but nothing reaches them, and they reach nothing. You can spend an hour with them and come away having learned nothing true about them, and them having learned nothing true about you. Because the interaction happens at the level of surfaces, and there is no surface interesting enough to make that worthwhile. Arya, against all odds and all narrative logic, keeps the aperture open. There is a version of this story that would celebrate Arya's transformation into someone harder, into the efficient, unfeeling instrument that the faceless men tried to make of her. There are readers and viewers who do celebrate this, who find in her coldness a fantasy of invulnerability, of having been through enough that nothing can touch you anymore. I want to gently push back on that reading, because the most interesting thing about Arya is not her hardness, it's the softness that persists despite everything. Real hardness is not strength. Real hardness is the failure of adaptation, the inability to stay permeable to experience, to let new information in, to remain capable of being changed. The hard person is not invulnerable, they are merely stuck. Unable to grow further because growth requires the capacity to be affected, to be moved, to be occasionally wrong. Arya is hard in the tactical sense, in the sense that she can do difficult things without flinching, that she has trained herself past certain kinds of hesitation, that she has learned to act decisively in situations that would paralyze someone less prepared. This is real and valuable. But she is not hard in the deeper sense. She is not closed. She still grieves. She still connects. She still wants things that have nothing to do with the list. Justice, yes, but also belonging, and the cold north smell of home, and the particular joy of a horse ridden fast in open country. The hardness that stories sometimes celebrate in characters like Arya is actually a description of trauma's cost, not trauma's triumph. The person who can genuinely feel nothing, who has closed all the apertures, he has cauterized the wound so thoroughly that no new blood can flow there. That person is not free. They are simply differently imprisoned. What Arya demonstrates is something much rarer and harder to achieve: the capacity to be both hard and open, tactically decisive and emotionally present, capable of violence and capable of tenderness. The two things coexisting, without contradiction, without one cancelling the other. That is the integration. That is what the story is actually about, beneath all the swords and conspiracies. The long, expensive, improbable integration of a person who was broken into several pieces and somehow found a way to be whole. A note about the revenge, since we've been circling it all evening without fully addressing it. Some of the names on the list, Arya eventually acts on. The story gives her these moments, and they are complicated morally, emotionally, tonally. They are not presented as triumphs, exactly. Or rather, they are presented as triumphs of a kind that asks you to sit with the complexity of what triumph costs. When revenge is accomplished, there is usually a silence afterward that is different from the silence of anticipation. The silence of anticipation has tension in it, the gathering before the release. The silence after is emptier, flatter. The name is crossed off the list. The wrong is righted, in the only sense it can be righted, and the person is gone who carried the wrong, and the person is still here who was wronged, and something was supposed to be different now. It isn't, quite. This is the story that gets told quietly. In all the realistic accounts of revenge and justice, that the thing you expected to feel after the accounting is less than what you felt before it. That the list sustained you in a way that finishing the list can't sustain you. That there is a grief on the other side of revenge that no one warns you about. The grief of losing the purpose that organized your suffering. The grief of having to become someone who is no longer defined by the thing they were trying to fix. Arya comes through this. She always comes through. But she comes through it changed, and quieter, and more firmly herself, and less certain of the comfort the list used to offer. She is moving, by the end, toward something that isn't about the list at all. Toward the horizon. Toward the unknown. That is its own kind of answer to the question of what to do when the list is finished. We began tonight with the idea of a silence that isn't empty, a silence that has weight and texture and history. And we've moved through a great deal of story and psychology and quiet reflection since then, and I want to bring a few of those threads back around now. The list. Think about the list again, but from a different angle. At the beginning, the list is a grief mechanism, a way of organising loss into something that feels actionable. A child's answer to the experience of total powerlessness. I cannot bring them back. I cannot undo any of this, but I can remember who did it, and I can make a promise to myself in the dark that one day the accounting will happen. That's what the list is at the beginning, and it's heartbreaking if you let yourself feel it, because it is so nakedly human, so recognisable. Most of us have made some version of this list. Most of us carry some version of this accounting. But here's what happens to the list over time. As Arya moves through the world and the list is tested against reality, some names come off it because circumstances change, because understanding deepens, because the person turns out to be more than a symbol of what was taken. The Hound, because name she kept, and who kept appearing, and who complicated himself relentlessly until he was a person to her rather than just a grievance. The list doesn't stay frozen, it breathes, it changes as she changes. Which means it was never really about the names. It was about the continuity, the thread back to herself. And then consider the silence again, but now with all of this in it. The silence of a person who carried a list for years, through everything, through total dissolution and reconstruction and return, who came back to herself for the hardest possible route, who learned to wear other faces and then discovered that her own face was still there underneath, still waiting, still hers. That silence is enormous. It contains a whole world. Before we move to the final passage, I want to speak to your body for a moment, directly, practically, the way Sirio might. Notice where you are holding tension right now, not in the story sense, in the literal, physical sense. The shoulders, perhaps, slightly raised, slightly forward, the old bracing habit, the jaw, slightly clenched, the hands, loosely closed rather than fully open. Let them go, one by one, if it helps to do it that way. Shoulders down, back wide, jaw unclenched, mouth slightly open, hands open, palms up or down, entirely relaxed. The breath will follow. It always does. When the body stops bracing, the breath can go all the way down, into the bottom of the lungs, the deep, slow breath that the nervous system reads as safety. You are safe right now. Whatever the list contains, whatever the names on it, whatever the weight of the year or the day or the accumulation of difficult things, right now, in this moment, you are safe. The darkness outside the window is just the ordinary night. The silence in the room is just the absence of the world's demands. And your body, tired and carrying what it carries, is allowed to rest, but not today. Well, I see you alive. What's your take? She goes home. At the end of her arc, she goes home to Winterfell. And then she leaves again, not running, not fleeing, but choosing. There is a map in the world she lives in, with a section marked Terra Incognita, unknown lands west of Westeros, where no ship has ever returned from. And she decides to go there. This is her last act as a character. A choice made and full knowledge of the risk, not because she is reckless, but because she has become, through everything, someone who needs to know, someone who cannot look at an edge and assume nothing is on the other side. Someone for whom the known world is no longer enough. Homecoming first. That part is important. She doesn't go directly to the horizon from Braavos. She goes home first. She goes back to the cold grey castle that smelled like pine resin and bread and her father's particular presence. She walks back through the gates of Winterfell with everything she has become, and she lets that place hold her for a while, the way it was always built to hold things, permanently, silently, without judgment. There is wisdom in that. You have to go home before you can leave properly. You have to see who you were, in the place where you were it, before you can be clear about who you have become. The homecoming is the closing of the loop, the reconciliation with the before, the act that says, I came from here, this is where the story started, I have not forgotten, and I am not what I was, and that is also all right. Then the horizon. Homecoming is not the same as staying. You can love a place with great completeness and still know it is not where you are supposed to remain. You can honour the roots and still reach toward the sky. Arya does both. She honours Winterfell by returning to it, by fighting for it, by being exactly who she always was in its cold stone corridors. And then she honours herself by acknowledging that there are things she still needs to know that Winterfell can't teach her. That's not a tragic ending. There's nothing dark in it. It's actually a portrait of a person who has done the work so completely that they've earned a freedom of genuine curiosity, who has survived the worst and come through and found on the other side not numbness or revenge or comfortable retirement, but wonder, an appetite for the unknown. That is hard won, almost unimaginably so, but the story says it is possible. That the silence can become that what begins in grief and violence and the list murmured in the dark can end in a face turned toward the horizon with something that looks, from here, like hope. There is a version of Arya's ending that lives inside every person who has ever come through something difficult and emerged with their curiosity intact. The horizon is not only west of Westeros. It lives anywhere that you face honestly with an open heart. It is the conversation you've been afraid to have, the question you've been afraid to ask, the version of yourself you've been afraid to try on, in case it doesn't fit, in case the trying is embarrassing, the relationship you've been afraid to pursue, because the last one cost so much, the creative work you've been afraid to begin, because the finished form might not match the vision. Arya's horizon is literal. She sails west into the unknown, but the spirit of it is available anywhere. The spirit of it says, I have survived enough to know I can survive. I have lost enough to know what I can afford to lose. I have found myself in the wreckage of enough identities to trust that the essential me is not going anywhere, and so I can afford to be curious. I can afford to take the risk. The curiosity is the restoration. The appetite is the evidence that something in you has not been killed. The desire to know what is on the other side of the edge, that is the sign of life. That is the signal that the story is still going. Your story is still going. It is late now. Not here, maybe, where you are. Maybe it's any hour at all, any moment of the day, but in the quality of this conversation, it is late. The way it gets late inside a thought that has been followed carefully for a long time, through its turns and its depth and its occasional unexpected clearings. I want to stay with you for just a little longer, not to say something conclusive. Conclusions are for daylight, for conversations that have somewhere to be. This one doesn't. Think about the places in your own life where you've kept a list. Not necessarily of people, but of things. Old wounds that didn't get acknowledged. Moments of unfairness that never got addressed. Times when you needed something and no one came. Times when you said something that wasn't heard, or heard something that changed things permanently, or waited for an apology that is still not here. Most of us carry these, quietly, the way Arya carried her list, murmured in the dark, Not obsessively, not always, but there, present, a background hum beneath the ordinary day. These lists are not shameful. They are evidence of caring. You can only be on the receiving end of a list like this if you mattered, and you can only keep one if you loved something enough to grieve its loss. The question isn't whether to keep the list. The question is whether, someday, you might let it breathe differently. Whether the names on it might become stories rather than accountings. Whether the grief might soften, not disappear, not resolve into some tidy resolution, but soften into something that feels less like a wound and more like a scar. Scars are not bad things, you know. They are places that healed. Imperfectly, fitly, sometimes without full sensation, but healed. They are evidence of survival, of the body's determined, uninstructed intelligence doing what it does when given time and relative peace. Arya has scars, many. She doesn't hide them. She doesn't perform them either. They are simply part of the geography of her, the way the canals of Braavos are part of the geography of that city. Features of the landscape that were made by things that happened, that direct the flow of what comes after. You have them too. You have all of it that she has, in some proportion, in some form. The losses, the lists, the moments of invisibility, the places where you had to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible, the places where you discovered something in yourself that surprised you with its steadiness. You've been through things, and you're here. The night is long in the north. In Winterfell, winter means dark so long and so complete that it becomes its own kind of presence. The darkness isn't the absence of something, it is a thing in itself, heavy, particular, full of its own cold logic. Arya grew up in that darkness. She learned its rhythms. She learned that it was survivable, that it had a pace to it, that it came to an end. Not quickly, not easily, but it came to an end. The long nights of your own life, the ones that stretched without apparent limit, the ones that made you doubt morning was real, they also came to an end. Not all of them, yet. Some of them are still underway. Some of them will be underway for a while longer. But the pattern holds. The dark has a limit, even when it doesn't look like it from inside. What Arya knew by the end, what she'd earned through everything, was that the night was not the truth of things. It was a condition, a temporary and survivable condition. The truth of things was larger than the night and waited on the other side of it, patient and unchanged. Not today. The phrase works as a good night too. Not today, to all the things pressing in. Not tonight. Not in this particular darkness, which is quiet and mine, and not a place for all the difficult business of the waking world. Let that business wait at the threshold. It will be there in the morning, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same weight. But morning will be different from right now, lighter, more manageable, less total. Morning always is. There is something in the body that knows this. Not the anxious mind, which has no confidence in morning, but something deeper, something older, the circadian intelligence that has been tracking the movement of light and dark for as long as there has been a body to track it. This body has survived every night it has ever been through. It is woken from every darkness. It has a kind of earned confidence in morning that the mind, caught up in its immediate suffering, can't always access. Let the body carry that confidence tonight. Let the deep animal knowledge that morning comes be the thing that holds you when the mind can't quite manage it. There is one last thing I want to offer before I leave you to sleep. There is a moment in every person's relationship with their grief, their list, their wound, their carried weight, when the question becomes, is this thing still serving me, or am I now serving it? The list served Arya. For years, it truly served her. It kept her alive, kept her connected to herself, gave her purpose in the absence of purpose. She needed it. It was the right tool for the situation she was in. But tools are for tasks. And when the task changes, the tool changes. The knife that was exactly right for cutting away the undergrowth is not the same knife you want when you sit down to eat. The same weight that kept you anchored in the current will pull you down once you reach calm water. At some point, gently, without drama, without announcement, the list stops being what you carry and starts being what carries you. It stops being the thread you hold and starts being the thing holding you in place. And the question is whether you can feel that change when it happens. Whether you can trust yourself enough to set down what has been keeping you safe and simply be in the space where it used to be. The space will feel strange at first, empty in a way that will feel, briefly, like something is wrong. But it isn't wrong. It is just space, and space is where new things grow. Arya didn't put down her list in any dramatic way. There is no scene of it. The list simply appears less and less in her later life, the way a crutch appears less and less as the leg heals. Quietly, without announcement. The healing is evident not in any act of letting go, but in the simple fact that she is walking without it, and doesn't seem to notice. That is how the deepest healing goes. Not in dramatic moments of release, but in the ordinary accumulation of days in which the wound is simply not the first thing that appears in the morning, in which the list is not the first thing murmured in the dark, in which something else, curiosity or warmth, or the particular pleasure of a cold morning and a warm cup, and a life that is, imperfectly and preciously, your own, comes first instead. This is not forgetting. I want to be precise about that. There is a common misunderstanding that healing means forgetting, that releasing the grief means dishonouring the loss, that letting the list rest means that what was on it didn't matter. It doesn't mean any of those things. The people she lost are real, the losses are real, the injuries are real. They always will be. Nothing that happens now will unmake what happened then. The grief is earned, and the grief is right, and the grief belongs. It will always belong. What changes is not the reality of the loss, but the relationship to it. What shifts is the geography. It moves from the foreground to the background, from the centre to the periphery, from the first thing to the last thing. It is still there. It informs everything, but it no longer stands in front of the sun, and the sun, once visible again, turns out to be there, waiting, patient, warming. You are allowed to let the grief move to the back. You are allowed to let the list rest. You are allowed to wake up some mornings and feel, for a while, before remembering, that the world is actually fine. That there is warmth in it and something worth waking to, and a version of forward that is not running away from anything, but simply moving towards something good. Arya earned that, through years of the hardest possible work. So did you. One more thing before we reach the final stillness. About courage, which is a word the story uses often, and I've been reluctant to use because it gets misapplied so frequently. There is the courage we celebrate in stories, the dramatic, sudden, visible courage of the decisive moment, the courage of stepping forward when stepping back would be easier, the courage of the sword raised at the right moment, the words spoken into a powerful silence, the refusal to bend when bending would be safer. This is real courage, and Arya has it. She demonstrates it again and again. But there are two other kinds that the story also depicts, more quietly, that I think are actually harder. The first is the courage of continuing, the courage of the next morning, and the next morning, and the next morning, after a loss so large that every morning feels like a small act of defiance against the weight of what happened. Not dramatic, not visible, requiring no audience and receiving no applause. Just getting up again, eating something, speaking to another human being, continuing to be present in a life that has been diminished without permission. This is what Arya does for years in the long stretches between the dramatic moments. She continues, she persists, she does not stop. And this is the hardest thing in the story actually, though it looks like nothing from the outside. From the outside, she is simply moving. From the inside, every step is a choice not to stop. The second kind is the courage of remaining open, of not closing into the invulnerability that suffering offers as a kind of terrible comfort, of choosing, again and again, to let things matter, knowing that things that matter can be lost, knowing that the price of caring is the possibility of grief, knowing that the alternative to this vulnerability is a kind of safety that is also a kind of death. Arya chooses to remain open, not by the dramatic, theatrical opening of someone who has been told that vulnerability is the secret to happiness, but by the small, daily, practically invisible choice not to stop caring, not to stop feeling, not to close the last aperture against the world and live in the cold centre of the self where nothing can reach you. She keeps the list, she grieves, she forms unexpected connections, she lets the hound be complicated, she saves Lady Crane, she goes home. All of these are acts of radical openness. All of them are courage, in its quietest form. And then finally, the horizon, which is both a physical destination and the ultimate act of opening, the willingness to face the unknown with something other than dread. The willingness to say, I don't know what is out there, and I am going anyway. And the not knowing is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced. That is what wonder looks like in a person who has been through everything Arya has been through. Not naive and unguarded. She knows what the world can do, but open, still permeable, still capable of being surprised into something that might be joy. I want to say something about why we tell stories like this, why we return to them, why they work on us in the late night in ways that straightforward advice or self-help or exhortation never quite manage. Stories bypass the defences. The analytical mind, which will argue with a stated principle and find its exceptions, doesn't know what to do with Arya Stark. It can't object. It can't reason itself out of being moved. It can only receive, and in the receiving, something shifts. Something that was held gets slightly released. Some recognition occurs that is not intellectual, but deeper. The recognition of, this is me, in some form. I know this. I have been here. I am here. That recognition is not nothing.
That recognition is in fact quite a lot.
When you see your experience given form in a story, when the specific texture of a suffering you thought was private turns out to have been known well enough for someone to write about it, something lonely in you becomes slightly less alone. The isolation that difficulty creates, the sense that what you're going through is too particular and too strange to be understood by anyone else, softens because someone understood it well enough to make Arya. And you understood it well enough to recognize her. The story doesn't fix anything. It doesn't solve the problems or heal the wounds or cross the names off a list, but it witnesses. It says, yes, this is a real thing. This experience of loss and resilience and the long work of remaining yourself through everything that tries to take you apart, this is real, this is known, this has been lived by others, you are not alone in it. And sometimes that witnessing is all you need for one night. Just the sense of being seen. Just the quiet recognition that the particular shape of what you're carrying has been held before by other hands in other darknesses, and those hands were not destroyed by it. They carried it and continued and found their way, in their own way, to something like the horizon. Before the very end, I want to say something about the wolf. Nymeria is Arya's dire wolf, who she released into the wild early in the story, sending her away to save her life. She runs off, and she is gone, and Arya never fully stops thinking about her. Nymeria, by the time we see her again, has become something enormous, a wolf of extraordinary size and wildness, leading a massive pack through the countryside, operating by her own logic, answering to no one. She has become, in her years of freedom, something far larger than a pet or a companion animal. She has become herself, fully, in whatever way a wolf can be. When Arya finally encounters her again, she has a brief, profound moment of recognition. Nymeria recognizes her. There is something there, the old bond, the original connection, the thing that was real between them. But Nymeria does not come back. She looks at Arya, and then she leads her pack away into the dark. And Arya says, quietly, watching her go, "That's not you. Not sad, not abandoned." Simply recognizing that Nymeria too has become herself, has grown past the relationship into something it could never have contained, and that this is right. This is how it should be. There is an enormous quiet generosity in that moment, the willingness to love something without requiring it to stay. The capacity to recognize another being's necessary wildness and honor it, even when it means the loss of the particular connection you had. This is love in its most spacious form, not the possessive love that says, "Stay near me, I need you here," but the expansive love that says, "Go where you must go, be what you must be," and the fact of what we were to each other remains true regardless of distance. Arya releases Nymeria twice, once at the beginning to save her life, once at the reunion to honor her freedom. Both times, the release is the loving act. Both times, the holding on would have been the lesser choice. The wolf runs, and Arya watches her go, and then turns and continues. That's the part the story never quite says out loud, but I think it means. I think that's what all the suffering and wandering and dissolution is in service of. Not the revenge, not the triumph, not the political outcomes of the war. Just that. The fact of still being here, the fact of having moved through all of it and retained, despite everything, some essential something. A girl's Arya Stark of Winterfell. And you are who you are, wherever you're from, whatever you've carried, however long the night has been. And the silence that settles around that fact, the silence that has lived through something and knows it, that silence is full. Completely, quietly, extraordinarily full. Let it in now. Let it fill the room. Let the names on the list rest for a little while. They'll be there tomorrow if you need them. But for now, let the list fold itself up and let the darkness hold it for you. Feel the weight of the blanket, the particular temperature of the air, the sound or near absence of sound that means the world is doing its own quiet work and doesn't need you for a little while. You don't need to be anyone right now. You don't need to be brave or sharp or ready or moving. You don't need to know the answers to the hard questions that have been following you around. They will still be there in the morning, and the morning will make them slightly more manageable than they seem right now, in the particular vulnerability of the late night. You can simply be here, in the dark, with the long list of everything you've survived, and let it soften slowly into something like peace. The cold stone of Winterfell can hold you tonight. Its walls are thick enough. They have absorbed centuries of this. Centuries of grief brought inside and set down by the fire. Centuries of people who kept going when they didn't think they could. Centuries of lists murmured in the dark and slowly, over years, released. The walls of that place know what you're carrying. They've held it before. They'll hold it again. Let it go now. Let the dark hold it. Not forever, not as a permanent condition. Just tonight. Just for now. The west of Westeros can wait. The horizon is still there. The unknown lands are patient. Nymeria is running somewhere. Somewhere in the world, there is a great grey wolf with yellow eyes, moving through forest that has no name, followed by a pack she didn't ask for and didn't expect, entirely herself, entirely free. You don't need to run tonight. You can be still. Everything can wait. Sleep.